Well, welcome to the QUEDOS debates. We're very excited about these debates. It's going to be a wonderful interactive discussion. You are encouraged to ask questions, to interrupt, to take part in the discussion, because this is to be as interactive and as productive and exciting as possible. We're very pleased to welcome Sir Nicholas Montagu, Chair of Queen Mary Council, who will be joined in conversation with Professor Wayne Parsons from the Department of Politics and Professor Michele Barrett from the School of English and Drama.
Thanks, Johanna. This is the first of these mini debates, and what we're going to do is Wayne's going to talk first briefly, and then we'll have a bit of conversation about what he says. Same with Michele, and then after about a quarter of an hour or less, we'll throw it open for your comments, your questions, and so on. But as Johanna says, we want this to be a really interactive event that covers the issues and takes in the points that you're interested in. So without more ado, we're talking about information here and transition to war, and I'm going to ask Wayne to kick off.
Thank you very much. War's really not my thing. Well, it was when I was a head of department, but that was some time ago. I'm a professor of public policy, and public policy is the study of how human beings define and construct those problems and solutions to those issues they consider to be public. So it's about understanding human problem-solving activity. And, of course, a crisis of any kind to any government or to any decisional group is a very interesting thing from my point of view as a policy analyst, because crises expose, if you like, some of the fault lines in any group. And there's a lot of research on the nature of group dynamics and what happens when, if you like, fractured or rather pathologically formed groups are affected by crises. And crisis, I suppose, is a fascinating aspect of what I study. And there can be no doubt that in a democracy, war is the biggest crisis which, if you like, decision makers and policy makers have to face. And of course, it has ever been thus. War is always a very profound challenge to democratic societies. We know, for example, I think it's a fact that no two democratic societies have ever gone to war against each other. Democracy and war are not things that, if you like, naturally fit together, because it calls for very different things. War calls for secrecy and deception, and lying and cheating. It's said that truth is the first casualty of war. In a democracy, on the other hand, we place a very high regard on openness and a flow of information. And war inevitably fractures this relationship, this informational relationship, which is fundamentally a trust relationship. War actually creates severe tensions for a democracy, because during a war, a government inevitably has a different relationship to this particular problem than to other problems. As I say, it's ever been thus. But increasingly, I think that the utility of force, as one of our great generals, General Sir Rupert Smith, in one of his recent books, talked about, the utility of force is something that professional soldiers and other scholars working in this field are increasingly questioning in our age. I mean, what is the utility of an army? What is the utility of engaging in strong force and strong power? And Sir Rupert, as other scholars in the field of war, have pointed out that modern warfare places new stresses upon the relationship between the military and the state and the citizenry. Because old-fashioned warfare, the kind of warfare my father and my grandfather engaged in, was fairly straightforward. My father fought in the North African campaigns and up through Italy, and he said it was very straightforward. You had Rommel over there who was trying to kill you, and you were over here trying to kill them. Very straightforward war. And equally for my grandfather in France, very straightforward war. But Sir Rupert and other scholars now point out that this kind of utility of force in contexts where the objectives of war are not so easily defined. What counts as winning, what counts as losing, as it's not so easily defined. This puts a lot of pressure on, if you like, the democratic consent, inevitably. So, to what extent can modern warfare secure the kind of consent? As we see every day during the present conflict, images, very potent images of young men and women coming home in coffins is a very, very sort of dangerous precedent. My late father always commented on this. He said it must be very difficult. You know, in the Second World War, we didn't have this kind of constant seepage of watching and listening to people who were talking about bereavement and death of their loved child. But that's what we have now, and it's very difficult, in a sense, to extricate us from this. Some criticisms recently of the BBC saying they're dwelling too much on the human price. And it's creating a sense of, is this war worth fighting for? The old war, in a sense, that Sir Rupert is talking about and war scholars talking about, is a war in which the state and government and policymakers require a different kind of relationship. And that takes me, I suppose, to our theme. Because I would argue that if the concept of a just war is far more problematic, then the utility of war is also to do with the utility of information, the utility of transparency, the utility of openness. And it seems to me that the challenge for policymakers now, and indeed as Sir Rupert's pointed out for the military, is to engage in warfare, and sometimes warfare, as he and other scholars would admit, is necessary, but to engage in that warfare in ways that build trust and consent, and that has to do with openness, and that has to do with transparency. The other thing I'd say is that from studying the decision on Iraq from various reports, official reports that we know, the Senate, for example, inquiry on the decision in Iraq, has drawn attention to another aspect of the role of information in war. And that is that oftentimes human beings can become very locked in to a set of decisions. And groups can behave in ways that are not fully rational. Those of you who might have studied this phenomena would know it as groupthink. That is to say that it's quite possible that people are not challenging assumptions, are seeing what they want to see, and in which policy is not evidence-based. Evidence, if you like, is policy-based. And that's always a danger. And I think that what we've learned, I think, about, and the Chilcot inquiry is to make another foray into this whole business in the case of the UK. I think what we've learned from that is that during the decision to engage in the Iraq conflict, there are questions which can be raised about, in a sense, what was happening to information even within the key decisional groups. Now, I would say that if we are to think about a future for the utility of force, we have to be thinking very closely in our democracy about what kind of flows of information, what kinds of transparency can we now generate in order to ensure that conflict, when it comes, almost as it inevitably comes, generates the kind of trust and support for military engagement.
Thank you very much. Do you think that the kind of things you've described have actually created new rights, or do you think they've simply created new ways of meeting those citizens' rights?
Well, I think if you consider, for example, the way in which parents and wives and husbands now feel that, in a sense, they do have a certain different relationship to what's happening than people did in the past. That I think that in that sense, we now expect, I think, hasn't the Queen already signalled this by actually giving medals to the parents and the family of dead soldiers?